The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, recently published 4 landmark regional assessment reports, one each for the Americas, Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and Asia and the Pacific. The result of 3 years of work by more than 550 leading experts from over 100 countries, the 4 IPBES reports are the most important expert contribution of the past decade to the state of knowledge about biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. The reports focus on answers to key questions about the importance of biodiversity, progress being made to conserve it, and the threats and opportunities for a sustainable future. With the best available information communicated effectively, people all over the world can make better decisions and take more effective action to meet global commitments such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Africa has significant natural assets underpinned by rich biodiversity. There are, however, more African plants and animals threatened today than at any time in the past. By 2050, Africa's current population is expected to double, while more than half of all African bird and mammal species may be lost before the end of the century due to climate change. In addition, significant losses of African plant species and a 20 to 30% drop in the productivity of Africa's lakes are likely. The IPBES report reveals that about 6.6 million square kilometers of land in Africa is currently degraded, and that the impact of natural drivers, such as diseases, pests, and natural disasters, has increased over the past 20 years, worsening climate impacts, land degradation, loss of habitat for migratory and other species, and loss of soil fertility, productivity, and economic opportunities. Such impacts threaten the food, water, energy, and health security of people across the continent. While some measures and interventions in Africa have resulted in positive changes, the IPBES report emphasizes the need for appropriate governance, policies and national implementation, more effective integration of indigenous and local knowledge, and better supported use of scenarios in decision-making if the region is to meet its sustainable development targets and commitments. The message from all 4 IPBES regional assessment reports is that, with the exception of some positive examples, biodiversity and nature's capacity to contribute to people are being degraded, reduced, and lost due to a number of common pressures, including habitat stress, the overexploitation and unsustainable use of natural resources, air, land, and water pollution, increasing numbers and impacts of invasive alien species, as well as climate change, among others.
The best available evidence, gathered by the world's leading experts, points us now to a single conclusion. We must act to halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, or risk not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. Fortunately, the evidence also shows that we know how to protect and partially restore our vital natural assets.
IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the IPBES webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the short video teasing the findings of the Africa assessment, and that you're looking forward to going more in-depth into the assessment findings with Emma Archer and Lutando Tsiba, 2 of the assessment co-chairs. Before giving the floor to Emma and Lutando, I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, will be made available on the IPBES website. On the IPBES website, you can also access a range of other resources, including recordings of all previous webinars, the full report and summary for policymakers for the Africa assessment, as well as any other completed IPBES assessment, and e-learning tools. If you have any questions about the webinar series or any other aspects of IPBES work on capacity building, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on email tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. With that, let me hand over to our presenters for the day. Thank you both, Emma and Uthando, for taking the time to join us. We look forward to hearing your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hakon, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our participants, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for making time to join us. We'd like to share with you about the Africa Assessment Report, the summary for policymakers, which was approved in March 2018. But to start, I just want to give a background to the assessment process, reflecting on how we got to the final report. The report was prepared by more than 140 experts from more than 30 countries across the world. A majority of the experts were obviously from the continent of Africa. The process was run over 3 years, and we drew on more than 2,000 sources, including scientific papers, government reports, indigenous and local knowledge, and a variety of other sources, including case studies that have been conducted across the continent. It was improved by comments that were received from governments and other external reviewers. More than 3,000 comments in particular were very helpful in helping us to improve the quality of the report. We integrated those comments and the inputs made, and we now have this final report, which we are presenting to you. It was approved in Medellin, Colombia, at the 6th session of the IPBES plenary, and we are happy to move into the details of the report and share with you some of the key findings from the assessment. One of the first things we want to reflect on, among others, is the fact that Africa has rich natural resources, and this natural heritage is unique. Africa's extraordinary rich biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as its wealth of indigenous and local knowledge, are an important asset to the continent of Africa. Africa is the last place on Earth with a significant assemblage of large mammals, including mega herbivores like elephants, hippo, rhino, and others. And these iconic species represent Africa's contribution to humanity, and are an important source of pride for the African continent. This rich biodiversity and Africa's ecosystem services and the wealth of indigenous and local knowledge comprise strategic assets for Africa's sustainable development. And we believe that they present great opportunity for a variety of opportunities for development on the continent of Africa. Africa has been endowed with marine and coastal ecosystems that are very diverse and provide significant economic, social, and cultural contributions to the people of Africa. In some regions, they contribute more than 35% of the gross domestic product. However, this rich diversity is underestimated in the continent, and we believe that this is partly because there have been very few studies conducted on the value of nature's contributions to human well-being in the continent. We also note that Africa's biodiversity is under pressure. In particular, we see that many of the drivers of biodiversity change, particularly those drivers that impact biodiversity negatively, such as climate change, habitat conversion, overharvesting, pollution, invasive alien species, illegal wildlife trade, as well as changes in demography of the African continent have all increased and have all are projected to have negative impacts on biodiversity into the future. These changes, their severity, their frequency, as well as their extent on the continent across the different subregions of the continent and across different ecosystem types are increasing and have got negative impacts. The only driver of biodiversity change that we found to have positive impact has been the declaration of protected areas, which has contributed to the conservation of important biodiversity areas as well as important bird areas in various parts of the continent. We also found that some 20% of the continent's land surface, about 6.6 million square meters or more than 600 million hectares, is estimated to be degraded because of soil erosion, salinization, pollution, and loss of vegetation or salt fertility. This is an area equivalent to about 1/5 of the size of the continent. Basically, if you take the continent and you divide it into 5 equal parts and you take out one portion, that's the portion of land that is degraded. Coupled with this is the fact that Africa's population is increasing rapidly and is projected to double by 2050, putting severe pressure on the continent's biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. We believe that the impacts of policy and strategies adopted by the continent can still halt the negative impacts of a growing population and a rapidly urbanizing population when carefully implemented. However, we note the fact that Africa's growing population also comes with an increase in demand for resources, particularly in demand for housing to accommodate a growing population, a demand for housing in urban areas, which is usually rapid and unplanned, and therefore causes immense pressure on biodiversity due to pollution, degradation of landscapes, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas. Africa as a continent is also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. By 2100, climate change could result in the loss of more than half of African bird and mammal species and could result in a significant loss of various African plant species. It is also projected that around the same time, about 20 to 30% of Africa's lakes will lose productivity, and this is likely to have major impacts on biodiversity and livelihoods of African communities. Poaching and illegal wildlife trade are also causing major impacts on species, and a significant number of African species across the different regions are vulnerable, endangered. In some cases, some species have been or have gone extinct. Overexploitation, habitat degradation and loss, as well as ocean acidification, pollution from land-based sources, invasive alien species, as well as climate change related impacts such as sea level rise, also threaten valuable marine ecosystems, threatening both their diversity and their ability to contribute to economy as well as livelihoods of communities living along the coast. Damage to coral reef systems, which is mostly due to pollution and climate change, has far-reaching implications for fisheries, food security, for ecotourism, as well as overall marine biodiversity. Now I'll hand over to my colleague, Emma Archer, who is going to take us through the rest of the findings of the Africa assessment. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Lutando. One of the critical focuses for the Africa assessment was to look at the targets to which we as a continent are committed. So really thinking whether we can achieve those targets. One of the ways we considered it was to look at the different types of targets to which we'd committed, and then to look at the extent to which we were moving away from the target, progressing towards the target, completely on track, in some cases being on track to exceed the target, but also where no significant change had occurred. Looking at, for example, awareness of biodiversity, the integration of biodiversity values, sustainable management of aquatic living sources, and targets such as reduction of pollution, which Lutando has already referred to. If we look at that further, we looked at the targets around mobilization of financial resources, integration of traditional knowledge, which of course is a critical focus for IPBES, ecosystem restoration and resilience. And again, for example, we see areas where there's been quite good progress. The green shows progress towards the target, but it has occurred at an insufficient rate. And really, in much of the case, we do see red and orange, which shows, unfortunately, moving away from the target or no significant change. So in the Africa assessment, we looked at what we call scenario archetypes, which are basically, we can consider them plausible futures for the African continent. We can see them here. They refer to fortress world, market forces, policy reform, local sustainability and regional sustainability, and all of those plausible futures are effectively underlain by particular assumptions. So, for example, in local and regional sustainability, we would assume that we have the opportunity to prioritize environmental sustainability more, whereas fortress world refers to a world where environmental sustainability is not necessarily prioritized and where things like security are more of a priority. Now, a critical finding in the Africa assessment was that if we look at our targets, for example, achieving AU Agenda 2063, achieving the SDGs, which is a critical target for the African continent, and also the achieving of the Aichi targets, is unlikely, highly unlikely, in 3 out of these 5 scenarios or plausible futures that we considered. Towards the bottom, those sustainability scenarios, or scenarios where we can make the assumption that sustainability is more of a priority, those give us a plausible future where the probability of reaching Aichi targets and SDGs is higher than in the others. And the regional sustainability scenario gives us a future where it is most plausible that we'll be able to achieve our targets or meet Africa's economic, social, and environmental development aspirations. But critically, in the Africa assessment, we want to consider what are some of the options around responding. For example, in the Declaration of Protected Areas. So Africa countries have declared 14% of the landmass and, importantly, 2.6 of our marine areas as protected areas. Other sites have been designated as wetlands of international importance, for example. We see the Declaration of Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas, an Alliance for Zero Extinction Sites where, for example, endangered or critically endangered species occur. We see recently in the news declarations around ecologically and biologically significant marine areas. There's significant evolution in community conserved areas, in UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and in examples such as biosphere reserves. So we have seen progress here, and it remains a critical response on the continent. For example, measures have been taken to protect biodiversity by African governments, and we do see some areas where we see a good track record. For example, we see expansion of protected areas in certain areas. We see some success in certain areas around controlling, for example, invasive alien species. And we see some success in certain areas around restoration of ecosystems where, for example, ecosystems are already contributing to the recovery of some threatened species. So there is some good news, and we've taken care in the assessment to emphasize that. Another critical response is taking polycentric governance approaches. So a polycentric governance approach is critical for our responses for enabling Africa's diverse natural assets to deliver benefits to people. Polycentric governance has actually been practiced for many years in Africa for managing diverse interests and resources, for example, trade-offs, and it's grounded in understanding process of accountability through stakeholder engagement and allowing equitable trade-offs, working across scales, sectors, values, and knowledge systems, including, importantly, integrating Indigenous and local knowledge. It builds a sense of social responsibility and allows us to integrate equity into looking at trade-offs. Critically, it harnesses consensus and what we call co-learning approaches, which are iterative, working through dialogue and knowledge co-production. And importantly, if we take an adaptive management approach, it offers us an element of agility, which is incredibly important when we consider the fact that the environment itself is changing rapidly. It allows us agility in responding to change, gives us opportunities for reducing conflict and prioritizing equity, and reducing the impact of trade-offs, as well as yielding positive results in the medium to the long term. Finally, some of our key considerations in the Africa assessment, and these are just some of the most critical examples. First of all, we have to work as a community on the continent to build the capacity of African researchers, policymakers, and institutions working together to make beneficial use of tools such as scenario analyses to help us make equitable decisions around trade-offs for long-term development planning. Secondly, it's clear that knowledge and data gaps persist, and we have to support and catalyze the filling of such gaps, in particular quantitative data, and that will allow us to improve our scenario development and to improve our modelling of plausible futures for Africa so that we can use these to inform our decision-making. And finally, a critical priority is that we need to implement periodic national assessments based on the most robust and up-to-date evidence in order to inform decision-making. To conclude, recorded webinars, not just from this assessment, but from other assessments as well, are available here. The full assessment report for Africa is available at the website shown, and we also have developing e-learning tools on the IPBES conceptual framework, as well as the guide for assessments. It's very important to note that if you have questions, you can address them to the email, which is the TSU for Capacity Building, not just about this webinar, but also about other webinars going forward.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Luthando, for taking the time to join us. I'm afraid that's all we had for today. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to have you join us again.